The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning when the autumn sun was just beginning to warm the marble floors of Richard Coleman's downtown office. His assistant brought it in with the usual stack of correspondence, and Richard barely glanced at it before slicing it open with the silver letter opener his father had given him 30 years ago. Inside was a school registration form. Richard pulled out his reading glasses and studied it with growing confusion. The child's name was Emma Grace Harrison, age 5, and there in the space marked father's name someone had written Richard Coleman in careful handwriting. Richard set down the paper and removed his glasses slowly. He read it again, then once more. His hands had begun to shake slightly and he pressed them flat against his desk to steady them. He was 58 years old. He had never married and he had no children. At least none that he knew of. The thought made his chest tighten with something between hope and fear. The return address showed a modest apartment complex on the east side of town. Richard sat with that paper for a long time while his coffee grew cold and his morning meetings came and went. Finally he picked up his phone and cleared his schedule for the rest of the day. The address led him to a neighborhood he rarely visited. The buildings here were older but well kept, with small gardens in front where children's toys lay scattered in the grass. Richard parked his car and sat for a moment gathering his courage. Then he walked up to apartment 2B and knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater and there was flour on her hands. When she saw him her face went pale. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly. "I received this in the mail today," Richard said, holding up the envelope. His voice was gentler than he had intended. "I think there's been some mistake." The woman closed her eyes briefly. "Please come in," she said. "I can explain." Her name was Natasha Harrison and her apartment was small but filled with warmth. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator. A worn sofa sat beneath the window. Everything was clean and carefully arranged. Richard could see she took pride in her home even though she clearly didn't have much. "I'm so sorry," Natasha said as she gestured for him to sit. Her hands were twisting together nervously. "I meant to send that form to someone else. To a friend who was going to help me with the registration. I must have mixed up the envelopes. I didn't realize my mistake until it was too late." "Someone else named Richard Coleman?" he asked. She shook her head and fresh color rose in her cheeks. "No," she said softly. "That part was intentional but it wasn't supposed to go to you." Richard waited. He had learned long ago that silence often brought truth more readily than questions. "Emma's father isn't in the picture," Natasha continued. Her voice was steady now though Richard could see the effort it cost her. "He left before she was born. The school has been asking for documentation and I've been stalling because I don't have any. A friend suggested I could put down any name just to satisfy the paperwork. She said they rarely check. I was looking at a business magazine when I filled out the form and I saw your name in an article. I don't know why I wrote it. I suppose I thought someone successful and respectable would look good on paper. I never imagined the form would actually reach you. I'm truly sorry for the confusion and any trouble I've caused." Richard looked around the small apartment again. Through the doorway he could see a child's bedroom with a neatly made bed and books arranged on a low shelf. Everything spoke of a mother doing her very best with limited means. "Where is Emma now?" he asked. "At kindergarten. She'll be home in an hour." Richard nodded slowly. He should have been angry. This woman had used his name without permission for fraudulent purposes, however innocent her intentions. But all he felt was a strange sadness mixed with something he couldn't quite name. "May I wait to meet her?" he heard himself say. Natasha looked startled. "You want to meet her? If you don't mind, I've come all this way." She studied his face for a long moment then nodded. "I'll make coffee." They sat together in that small living room and talked while the coffee brewed. Natasha told him about Emma. About how bright she was and how much she loved books. About how she asked questions constantly and made up elaborate stories about dragons and princesses. About how hard it was to raise a child alone on a receptionist's salary. Richard found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone. About how he had built his business from nothing after his own father died and left the family with debts. About how the years had passed in a blur of work and more work until suddenly he was approaching 60 and his big empty house felt like a monument to loneliness. About how he had always imagined he would have children someday but somehow that day had never come. When Emma arrived home she burst through the door like a small tornado with her backpack bouncing and her jacket already half off. She stopped short when she saw Richard. "Hello," she said with the frank curiosity of children. Who are you? Emma, this is Mr. Coleman, Natasha said. He's a friend of Mommy's. Emma walked over to Richard and looked up at him with solemn brown eyes. Do you like dragons? She asked. I don't know much about them, Richard admitted. Are they nice? Some are. Some are grumpy, but that's because people are scared of them and that makes them sad. Everything just wants to be loved, really. Richard felt something crack open in his chest. That's very wise, he said. Emma smiled at him then, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She climbed up on the sofa beside him without any shyness and began to tell him an elaborate story about a dragon who lived in the library and helped children find the right books. Richard stayed for dinner. It was just spaghetti and salad, but Natasha served it on cheerful mismatched plates and Emma chattered throughout the meal. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had felt so content. When he finally stood to leave, Emma hugged his legs. Will you come back? She asked. Richard looked at Natasha. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope maybe, or fear, perhaps both. If your mother says it's all right, I would like that very much, Richard said. He did come back. The next week he took them both to the zoo. Emma held his hand as they walked and pointed out every animal with delight. The week after that he brought books for Emma and groceries that he claimed were extra from some event at his office. Natasha accepted them with quiet dignity, though they both knew the truth. Slowly something grew between them all. Not romance exactly, though Richard found Natasha's quiet strength increasingly beautiful. Not obligation, though he felt a deep responsibility toward them both. It was something simpler and more profound. It was family in the way family is supposed to be. Built not on biology but on choice and care and showing up day after day. 3 months after that first knock on the door, Richard sat with Natasha after Emma had gone to bed. The registration form lay on the coffee table between them. The school year was starting soon. I'd like to make it real, Richard said quietly. The form, my name as her father. I can't undo the past, but I can be there for her future. For both of you, if you'll let me. Natasha's eyes filled with tears. You don't have to do that. I know, I want to. Why? Richard thought about that. About his big empty house and his successful lonely life. About a little girl who believed dragons just wanted to be loved. About a woman who had done her best alone and had raised something beautiful in the process. Because, he said finally, sometimes mistakes aren't really mistakes at all. Sometimes they're invitations we didn't know we needed. Sometimes they're grace arriving in the wrong envelope. Natasha reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you, she whispered. Richard squeezed her hand gently. Outside the window the autumn evening was fading into night. Inside this small warm apartment he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A place to belong. A reason to come home. A family built not on accident or biology but on something more solid than either. On kindness and choice and love that grows slowly in the spaces between words. Emma's school registration was filed the next week with Richard Coleman's name in the father line. This time it wasn't a mistake. This time it was a promise. And Richard Coleman had always been a man who kept his promises.